This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Salmond.
Hello and welcome to Scotland Speaks with Salmond. The party conference season has come and gone, but how has it left the state of politics with the UK election looming? Today, we ask the question, how have the political parties emerged from their respective conferences? Alex talks to top commentator Steve Richards on the state of the UK parties as the election countdown begins. The issue overhanging all of the conference season was not one of domestic politics, but the tragedy unfolding in the Middle East. Initially, it looked to divide the Labour Party, but the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, managed to provide the Prime Minister with the opportunity for sacking her over her intemperate views about policing of demonstrations. All of which provided a back-to-the-future moment with David Cameron's shock return as Foreign Secretary. However, the mounting death toll in Gaza is of far greater consequence than its implications for UK politics. In an exclusive report, we interview celebrated columnist and broadcaster Peter Oborne from Nablus in the occupied West Bank. But first, to our commentator and his thoughts on the party conferences.
I'm now delighted to be joined by Steve Richards, that astute commentator on the UK political scene. Steve, leaving aside for a second the dramatic events of earlier this week, in your assessment, how were the parties shaping up after the respective conferences?
Well, in a way, the party conferences were a prelude to the drama of earlier this week in relation to the cabinet reshuffle, because Sunak had high hopes, mistakenly, as it turned out, that his party conference, the leader's speech, would begin to change the dial. I think it's impossible to overestimate the impact of terrible opinion polls on a party leader's confidence. And he's been waking up to bleak polls for a long time. He thought the party conference speech might make a difference. It didn't. And therefore, we left the party conference season in virtually the same place as we entered it, with this sense of Labour having a commanding lead, even if Keir Starmer's overall project remains pretty vague in some respects. But then, of course, we had the Israel-Gaza tragedy still being played out, which I think again raised some questions for Labour. It was during Keir Starmer's party conference set of interviews that he told LBC, apparently, although he denies it, that he supported Israel's right to block energy and food into Gaza. Now, in a way, I think that's been the cause of all his problems. So even when a leader senses he is being triumphant, he can get into some difficulty. So that was Starmer's problem, and that's still being played out. But for Sunak, there are stages now, I think, of desperation. You wake up and think, well, that didn't work. I claimed to be the agent of change at the party conference. Well, now I'll try and bring back David Cameron and see if that works. And I think the opinion polls, you know what it's like being a leader of a party and First Minister. You do follow them. You can't help but follow them. And when they're bad, really do have an impact on your kind of sense of desperation.
Well, they were always sky high when I was First Minister, Steve. That was so, but I never had that total adversity that's overcoming the Prime Minister. But you interpret, therefore, the Back to the Future move of Barn Cameron as a last throw of the dice, almost.
Well, almost. I mean, there are other throws the election, I think, will not be until next autumn. But he clearly came back, saw that this message, I am the change maker, and he framed that over leaving the last 30 years behind at his party conference. Well, now he's brought back the Prime Minister for part of that period. And I think he now is attempting another move, which is partly aimed to kind of convey a sense of solidity by bringing back a former prime minister after the childish game and dangerous game playing of the likes of Suella Braverman. I mean, I think that's the intention. And I think it shows he feels a need for a weighty figure around him. Now, whether Cameron meets those criteria is another question. Clearly, Sunak feels he does. And this was one thing that has not been predicted in advance, and in a way has blown away the. Everyone thought the front page headline the following day would be Braverman sacked, but actually the return of Cameron has overshadowed that a bit. But I think the sacking is also significant because he has a troublemaker on the back benches who will be noisy, even if deeply unimpressive.
It's a bit of a sad commentary on the state of UK politics. A crisis engulfing the Middle East, tens of thousands now dead, is seen in terms of the interplay between the UK political parties. The Prime Minister trying to paint Keir Starmer as some sort of terrorist friend, Keir Starmer anxious to stay close to the Tory position, tensions in the Labour Party, and Suella Braverman seems to think the whole thing is a putative leadership bid. That's a pretty pathetic way to look at an international crisis of the gravity as what's happening in Palestine at the present moment.
I wouldn't call it pathetic, actually. I would certainly call it very parochial. And I think all those players who are partly reflecting on each move as to where that leaves them in the context of British politics are also aware of the horrors. So you can't be a human being and not being aware of it. But this happens in every situation of international conflict involving, albeit very indirectly, the UK, that one of the calculations made is where this leaves each of the parties and each of the leaders. I think, for example, in the build-up to Iraq, Blair's positioning can only be partly explained by his assessment of Labour's past as being anti-American, soft on defence, which is one of his factors in leading him towards the hell of Iraq. And here you can see calculations being made, and not necessarily being made very smoothly.
Now, of course, Steve Richards, you're the right person to ask about precedents for bringing back a former Prime Minister as a Foreign Secretary. How did that work out for Ted Heath?
It was a very different context. So he brought back Alec Douglas-Home, who'd been Prime Minister up until the 64 election. Wilson won it. The Tories went into opposition. Heath became Tory leader. When he won the general election in 1970, he brought his predecessor back as Foreign Secretary. And it worked pretty well. It was one of the more stable relationships in a very turbulent government, which famously only lasted 3.5 years. But the context was unrecognizably different. This was the beginning of a period of government. Heath had just won an election and was at his most authoritative when he made the decision. This one is the end of 13 plus years of Conservative rule, when Sunak, even his closest friend would admit, is in a very weak position. So I think, although there are precedents for this, it's not completely freakish, the context is very different, and I think looks more desperate and slightly odd, actually, because people are comparing it to when Gordon Brown brought back Peter Mandelson. But there was a symmetry to that move. Brown was having real problems with the ultra-Blairites in his parliamentary party, attempted coups on a near weekly basis. So he brought in the ultimate ultra-Blairite, the hero of the ultra-Blairites, to buttress his position very successfully. Cameron's problems are with all kinds of different factions in his party. You know, we've talked about the Braverman wing, and there's the Truss wing of tax-cutting fanatics, and there's the kind of British exceptionalist wing of, you know, hard Brexit's not hard enough and all. And yet he's brought back a Remainer who lost the Brexit referendum famously, with a very erratic track record in foreign policy. So I'm not wholly sure what it does for him, beyond giving him someone to speak to who's also been in his position. And he's tried a lot of other things that hasn't worked, so he's bringing in someone who's done it before as well.
And who presumably is not after his job. But it is a bit of a commentary both on his cabinet and indeed the 300 odd Conservative MPs, that he's actually saying there isn't one of them, in his estimation, who's fit to be Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, and they've got this big majority, so he's got a big choice. They won big in December 2019, so it's not as if he's got this really tiny majority in a relatively small parliamentary party. You can't move for Conservative MPs, but he has chosen this figure from the recent past, who I think, you know, does kind of share his politics. Cameron is not on the centre ground, this overused term. He's a Thatcherite in terms of economic policy, and so is Sunak. So the battle, I think, being played out is different sections of the right of the Tory party. You have Cameron and Sunak, kind of balanced budget, Thatcherite Conservatives. You have Liz Truss and her followers who are tax cutting, even if you have to borrow the money to do it, Reaganite Tories. You have Johnson, Britain, that is, you know, kind of British exceptionalists. But they're all on the right. But Sunak has reconnected with the first right-wing experiment, which was Cameron and Osborne's austerity programme. And I think Jeremy Hunt, as Chancellor, will be announcing really tough spending plans for after the next British general election, partly to trap Labour. So we're going to go full circle back to that kind of economic policy making.
Of course, one of the people relieved about this latest Tory convulsion will be Sir Keir Starmer, who looked like he was heading into some real trouble with the grassroots of the Labour Party, who wanted to see a much more vigorous opposition to the government's pretty unconditional support for the State of Israel.
Yeah, I think this remains very tricky for him for lots of reasons. One, it's a story, by the way, this is a peripheral part of the story, but this tragedy is still being played out. And emphatically, Starmer is not in control of it whatsoever. How can he be? And yet he has to supposedly stick to this policy of opposing a ceasefire. And the more graphic the images from Gaza, the harder that becomes. And so as long as this is going on, it's going to be tricky for him. Now, I don't think it will be fatal for him in terms of the general election, but part of his spell has been broken. The idea that here was someone in full command of his party, almost miraculously after the 2019 defeat, is shown to be not wholly the case. It would have been really amazing if it was the case, frankly, and it's not. And when an issue like this comes up, he is really challenged. And this is new to him. He's not that political. He hasn't been an MP for very long. And I think he still thinks partly like a director of public prosecutions. And this, and we're being very parochial about a tragedy, but in terms of party and management, it involves the kind of skills of a Harold Wilson type figure, a lot of guile and use of language which is smart and sensitive and empathic. And he's got qualities, but they aren't those. And he's being tested at the moment.
One point that occurs to me about David Cameron's elevation is that if I were a European leader, the Foreign Secretary is now the Prime Minister who resigned because of Brexit, would I not interpret that as a pretty devastating admission that Brexit has indeed been a disaster and perhaps a signal of a closer relationship to come?
Well, they might do that. I'm afraid, I think it will be mistaken, because Sunak, my impression of him is he's a pretty hardline Brexiteer. Maybe his time in the Treasury changed that a bit when he could see the damage Brexit was doing. But I wonder about that. I think it will be a tonal change. There won't be this, oh, if we have to break international law, good, we'll show them we can flourish, all that kind of stuff. All that will go. But Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, made the mistake of assuming Char would mean he would prevail in European negotiations, and it clearly didn't work then and won't now. I think European leaders will think, well, we've got this figure again who completely mishandled Brexit. And, what credence should we give him in his kind of, second coming? But others interpret it differently. There's been a lot of talk at Westminster about this showing that Britain will have a grown-up in the room when it comes to foreign policy. Let's see. I think his judgment was flawed in terms of foreign policy, whether it was Brexit or some of the other things that went on when he was Prime Minister. And there's no reason to assume that the period in which he's been making a fortune out of politics will necessarily have matured him in terms of foreign policy.
And for our Scottish viewers in particular, is there any chance that the new Foreign Secretary will say to the Prime Minister that he thinks a Scottish referendum is a jolly good idea, or would that be an extremely faint hope?
I think you can forget about that conversation happening in the period between now and the next general election.
Finally, Steve Richards, what does all this mean for the potential date of the election? Does the convulsions in the Tory party tend to point to as late as possible, and any thought of a dash to the polls in the spring looks pretty forlorn now? Would that be correct?
Yeah, well, I've never thought this dash in the spring made much sense. I'll be very interested in your view on this. You're a brilliant reader of the political rhythms. It seems to me it was wholly irrational, this thing, oh, he'll go in May because if he doesn't, the local election results will be so terrible. He'll be even more damaged during the summer. Well, if they're going to be terrible, you don't go for a general election. So my sense is it will be the autumn, that January 2025 will be too late, but that he will hang on as long as is practical and feasible in the hope that something turns up. And therefore he won't go in May. Do you agree? I mean, you've faced many of these electoral positions yourself. What's your sense?
A neat interview reversal, Steve Richards. Yes, I think the idea of any leader who still has a bit of discretion going to the polls 15 points behind is for the birds. I think that would tend. I mean, people always have an undying hope that something's going to turn up. And I dare say even Rishi Sunak thinks there must be something's going to turn up at some point, and therefore will go as long as possible. It'll be the last possible day, unless something, of course, does turn up.
Yeah, so you think it goes to January 2025. I don't, even if they're still way behind in the autumn. I think he'll have to go in the autumn. Rather than drag on in a kind of increasingly desperate kind of state.
Well, remember, of course, Stephen, one of the great aims of the Tory party is to have as few people voting as possible. The Tories have quite a good track record in elections near Christmas. So the less people voting and exercising their democratic rights, the more in the interest of the Conservative Party it might be. And of course, what's good for the Conservative Party must by definition, in some people's estimation, be good for the country.
Indeed. I keep on speaking to people at Westminster who agree with you that it could go to January 2025. I think he will lose control of the narrative, a bit like Gordon Brown did with his non-existent early election in 2017, was it? No, why not talk about 2017? Whenever it was.
So back end of 2007. It seems so far away these days. Steve Richard, can I thank you once again for a tremendous insight into the political scene at Westminster, and in particular getting me back into the position of answering a few questions instead of just asking them. So thank you for joining me in Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Now, in our last two shows, we featured the ALBA conference from the Woodside Halls in Maryhill, Glasgow, and in particular, this dramatic moment.
Conference. You may have noticed that speech was slightly shorter than some of the ones you might have been used to from me. There's a reason for that, and I mean all that stuff about the social media is very handy, because as I was making the speech and calling for new recruits to the ALPA party, I got a message saying a number of people were joining during the course of this live broadcast. And I would like you now to welcome the latest recruit to ALPA, and that is Miss Ash Regan, the MSP.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow Scots, it's good to be here. You know, I had planned to stay put at home for a weekend I had planned of household repairs, but then it dawned on me. What's more important, fixing a blocked drain or coming here to help unblock Scotland's path to independence? The reason I'm standing in front of you here today is because I believe that the SNP has strayed from the path to independence, and it's time for ALBA to get Scotland back on track.
And here is what you had to say about our show coverage of the Alba conference. Peem says, another great programme. Unfortunately, I couldn't get to the conference, but thoroughly enjoyed the online coverage. Very professional and extremely diverse. Well done to all. And with the wonderful Ash Regan on board, we can soar even higher. Gorbals Gal says, independent, inclusive, invigorating, intelligent, inspirational, all the eyes in Maryhill. In Alba Party, People and Policies, and in Scotland, soonest. Thanks again to and for Scotland Speaks to Alex Salmond. And to me, of course, Gorbals Gal. Jacqueline says, thanks Alex, Taz and all. Good wee snapshot of the Alba conference. Glad to see Ash cross the floor for independence. We all know New SNP are a party of comfortable devolutionists. Charles says, please rise on the wings of independence together. See, absorb and implement to the poem Love by Emmett Fox. This is all that needs to be done. Thanks for listening. Well, thank you, Charles. Now, because we were out and about in Maryhill over the last 2 weeks, we've had no Scotland's Hidden Heroes episode, much to the disgruntlement of some of our very keenest viewers. Well, Hidden Heroes is back this week, sponsored, as always, by Flagship Media. Over to Alex.
When I was a lad growing up in Livegate, there were 4 Scottish figures of fairly recent vintage who were revered above all. That was 3 sports people and 2 missionaries. So how does that work out? Well, there was John Panton, Scottish golfer. There was Willie Bald, King of Scotland, Hearts centre forward. There was Mary Slessor, the missionary, who was the subject of one of our previous Hidden Hero episodes. And the last person was Eric Liddell, who was both a sporting hero and a missionary. Hence you get 5 into 4. I was wondering whether to include Eric Liddell in this series, not because he's not worthy of it, because he clearly is, but because I thought he was too well known to be considered a hidden hero. However, I've been doing some Vox Pops recently, and I've suddenly realised it's now more than 40 years since the film Chariots of Fire made Eric Liddell's exploits as a sportsman so famous. So the children of the 1980s and 1990s were introduced to this fantastic Scottish legend, but perhaps the children of the modern years don't have as much knowledge, and they should have. I suppose particularly with the Paris Olympics coming up next year, the centenary of Eric Liddell triumphantly winning the gold medal in the 400 metres in 1924. Now, of course, there was much more to Eric Liddell than just being a sportsman and a runner. As he said himself, his athleticism was part of his faith. It was the way he expressed himself. He did honour to God. Eric Liddell wasn't just an athlete, he was a considerable rugby player. He was in part of the Scotland international side in the 1922 and 1923 Five Nations Championships. In 1923 they came within a few points of winning the Grand Slam. They were a considerable side and he was a great rugby player. But it was as an athlete and a sprinter that Eric Liddell had the greatest prowess. He could run like the wind. He was the 100-yard dash champion of Great Britain, the record holder. He was one of the favourites for the 1924 100-metre run in the Paris Olympics. And that's where his real claim to fame comes. Because not in the immediate run-up to the Olympics, as is suggested in the Chariots of Fire film, it shows him finding out this news as he boards the boat train. It was actually several months before that he realised that a number of the events that he was going to be starring in, the relay events for 400 metres, the relay events for the 100 metres, and the 100 metres itself, were going to have either the heats or the final run on Sunday. And Eric Liddell's faith precluded him from running on the Lord's Day. And this is where his rock-hard integrity comes in. And this is where the real admiration comes in. He had run 400 metres. It was one of the events he regularly competed in, but he wasn't by any means a world champion at that distance. His favoured events were shorter, and he changed his entire running style in order that he could compete in the 400 metres at the Olympics, an event where neither the heats nor the final was held on a Sunday. The appreciation of somebody prepared to stand up to the very considerable pressure, because as you can imagine, The tabloid press, just like they are now, went wild about this, that somebody could let down the country by refusing to run in an event just because it was on a Sunday. There was all great admirers, particularly in Scotland, but it was thought that he was sacrificing the potential of a British gold medal. But there were things more important to Eric Liddell than gold medals, and that was observing his faith. As he prepared for the 400 metres, he was very touched to get a message from 1 Samuel. Somebody wrote him a note which he was handed to in the run-up to the event, which says, "Those who honour me, I honour." A biblical quotation which showed that among his colleague athletes there were others who regarded his stance as a matter of principle. And so it was in the 400 metres in a world record extraordinary run. Eric Liddell triumphed against all expectations and carried the gold medal. That's what made him an athletic hero. But that's not what made him a hero in the Salmond household. He was a hero in the Salmond household because he refused to bend to the prevailing wind because of his iron faith. He returned to Shandong province and pursued his work as a missionary. In the Second World War, he was interned in a Japanese concentration camp, and there he died in the early months of 1945. His reputation was sky high among all of the people he met. An American inmate at the concentration camp later became a very famous evangelist. Once said that he never thought he'd meet a saint, but Eric Liddell was as close as he'd ever come. So a man who was greatly admired for his iron integrity, his willing to sacrifice everything to pursue his faith. He was little known really until the Chariots of Fire film, known in Scotland, known in sporting circles, known in missionary circles, but not incredibly famous until Chariots of Fire. And I think some of that fame has dissipated over the last few years. Perhaps there'll be a revival for the Paris 2024 Olympics as we realise what an extraordinary man this Scot was. In the 1990s though, and not long after the Chariots of Fire film was released, Edinburgh University erected a memorial stone at the concentration camp site in Shandong. It carries an inscription from Isaiah, which is particularly apt. "They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary." A great epitaph for a great Scot and a worthy addition to our catalogue of Scotland's hidden heroes.
It is seldom that an international issue dominates the UK political discourse, but currently the appalling slaughter in Gaza is setting the course of domestic politics, as witness the demise of the erstwhile Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. The UK government have relentlessly backed Israel from day one of the conflict. They've been shadowed by the leader of the opposition, but increasingly, public opinion has been touched by the plight of the Palestinians caught in the crossfire between the IDF and Hamas, and dissent has been growing within the Labour Party as a death toll mounts on a daily basis. However, the consequences of war in the Middle East go far beyond their implications for UK politics. They are epoch-making and world-changing. Alex speaks to the renowned journalist Peter Oborne from Nablus in the occupied West Bank.
Peter Oborne, we're seeing the horrific scenes from Gaza daily on our television screens. What are conditions like in Nablus in the occupied West Bank?
Well, they're nowhere near as bad as the sheer horror, Dante's Inferno, which is taking place in Gaza. But it is, nevertheless, it's tough. We are starting to see, it reminds me a little bit of an episode in British history you will be familiar with, Alex, the Highland clearances, the ethnic cleansing of communities, particularly not around Nablus so much, but further to the south, so in Mustafa Yatta, in the South Hebron Hills. You're getting villages being wiped out, people driven out of their villages. And around here in Nablus, which is a beautiful, ancient Roman city, we are under siege. You can't get out. The roads aren't working. They're blocked. You can't go out south towards Ramallah through the usual route. You have to go up into the hills to avoid roadblocks, to avoid checkpoints, to avoid marauding settlers. So it's an uneasy atmosphere, and the settlers are very violent. They go into the villages. They beat people up. They have machine guns. They stop the villagers, the local people, from collecting their olives. Often they steal the olives. It's a terrifying time for ordinary Palestinians. They're not like the horror scenes we are seeing all the time from Gaza.
And what's the feeling of Palestinians on the West Bank as they see their country people, their relatives in Gaza suffering to such extremity?
Well, what they see, almost every Palestinian has relatives, as you say, in Gaza. And there's a tremendous feeling when you talk to people of solidarity, but also shock. You know, you can't witness what is happening in Gaza without feeling a human sort of horror. And of course, if you're Palestinian, you feel that this could be happening to you, and you fear that they will come once Gaza is over. It will come to the West Bank too.
Now, Peter Oborne, if I may say so, you're unusual in right of centre commentators in the UK, in that you have a deep knowledge of the Middle East, and your sympathies have been largely with the Palestinian cause. Why is that such an unusual position for a commentator or right of centre figure in the UK?
It's quite an interesting point you're making there. I think something happened to the Conservative Party, which used to have, as you know, there was this Tory Arabist, as they called it, tradition. But something happened to the Conservative Party. It was captured by America, by the neoconservatives, which is American politics, as you know, is very sympathetic at the highest level. We see this with Joe Biden to the Israelis, and they have detached from the plight of the ordinary Palestinians. They seem to have lost sympathy. And actually, I see a continuity here with the Iraq War, where once again there's a very one-sided view of what takes place in the Middle East. Nobody's ever going to. You should never forget the awful things which happened Alex, to the Israelis on the 7th of October, the atrocities committed by Hamas against them. But how can you watch the inferno that Gaza has become, or listen to the awful talk we're getting now from Israeli leaders? Netanyahu conjuring up biblical genocide, the Amalek language, which is really not something you expect from a secular democracy, what claims to be a secular democracy like Israel.
Peter Oborne, as an experienced political journalist, is there a sense of deep frustration that so much of this seems to be role-playing in UK politics? The government trying to portray Keir Starmer as a terrorist sympathiser, Keir Starmer shadowing the government's position, Suella Braverman making a leadership bid. Whereas this issue should be seen for what it is, an issue of fundamental international importance. Is that a deep frustration for you?
Well, just speaking as a British citizen, forget about politics, looking at it from here, and I think for many, many people in Britain, what you have is two very odd things. One is a huge outrage whipped up by the right-wing press, whipped up by the Prime Minister, whipped up by the former Home Secretary against the marchers marching across Britain for peace and in solidarity with the Palestinians whose suffering is incredible. At the same time, not a word of sympathy, not a word of outrage, not a word of criticism from the British Prime Minister and his government against the Israeli government for the mass slaughter of what is well over 10,000 Palestinians now in Gaza, including probably 5,000 children. We've seen this on our TV screens all the time. And that is not something they will criticize Israel for at all, while going after the protesters. There's something deeply sick about this. Forget about the politics. It's just morally wrong. It's a betrayal of this thing they go on all the time about, which is British values. This is not British values to worry about somebody going on a march and accuse them as hate marchers and to just give a free pass to a government which is slaughtering people in their thousands and in uncountable numbers now.
Is it possible for you to interpret what the motivation behind the Israeli government is? Are they acting out of rage, as the American president warned, or is there an agenda to clear Gaza of all Palestinians? What is the end game to act in a way which is alienating the vast majority of world opinion, which initially, of course, was hugely sympathetic about the atrocity committed against Israelis?
I think as you know, the attribution of motive is always a mistake because you can never see into somebody other's heart or mind. But what you can do is look at what people say. And if you look at the statements made by the most senior Israeli politicians and the sort of stuff which goes out on TikTok and social media, we are talking about a deep sense of need for revenge. We are seeing this inhuman language, dehumanizing language. The president of Israel saying there are no innocent people, innocent citizens in Gaza. You're seeing the Israeli Prime Minister use biblical terminology to dehumanize, invoking biblical hatred of rival tribes from biblical times. You're seeing really disgusting genocidal language used, which does suggest that the objective is wiping out a large number of Palestinian people. And then you are also seeing evidence of these plans to clean Gaza, get rid of Gazans, maybe in due course open it up for resettlement by the Israelis. Then there are these plans which do exist, or get the Palestinians out into Sinai or into Egypt. This is all under discussion. It's quite horrifying, but I can't see what the motive is, and I cannot judge what the motive is of just what they're doing at the moment, or the purpose is, which is simply the slaughter of over 10,000 innocent people.
But this is a horrendous situation, because in previous conflicts in the Middle East, Israel has been led, even in the most desperate of conflicts, by military leaders who then became politicians, but who pursued an agenda to establish a peace at some point. People who'd actually done the fighting. Are there no figures like that left in the Israeli politics who can pursue and see an end game of peace as opposed to total destruction?
Well, I think that some of the military figures you're presumably referring to, like Sharon or Menachem or Begin, they were former military figures, but whether they pursued an agenda of peace or not is open to, at the very least, open to discussion. There have been great peacemakers in Israeli history. The last was Rabin, who got killed by a far-right.
Who was also a military leader, Peter.
He was, and perhaps that was the gentleman you were referring to. I mean, at the moment, we have Benjamin Netanyahu in his sixth term of Prime Minister, who, in order to save his skin, has entered into a coalition agreement with two of the most noxious figures in global politics, the Itamar Ben-Gvir, who he made a national security minister, and Smotrich, who's in charge not just of the Israeli economy as finance minister, but also the administration of the West Bank. These are far-right figures, guilty. Smotrich called himself a fascist homophobe at one kind. These are not people who would be, who could be regarded as at all sound, or in fact, they only offer despair at the thought that these people are running Israel at the moment.
And on the Palestinian side, I mean, Hamas in Gaza, the Palestinian Authority on the occupied territories, are there anybody emerging in the Palestinian leadership who could rally the Palestinian cause in a better way?
Well, one of the problems is that the Israelis have a habit of locking up, or sometimes perhaps killing, potential leaders from the Palestinian side. You're seeing the Mahmoud Abbas, the president, is about as old and as out of touch as Joe Biden in the United States, and really, he's not respected. Palestinian Authority is seen by Palestinians here in the West Bank as collaborators with Israel, rather than somebody a group which can be trusted. There is quite a lot of talk of sort of a technocratic government emerging. Hamas could not be the leaders of any new administration, to put it mildly. The PA is quite discredited. There is conversations to try and bring back maybe the old PLO, which Yasser Arafat's PLO, with perhaps highly technocratic figures who can rebuild the economy, which is, by the way, has been completely devastated, not just in Gaza, which has been destroyed, but also here on the West Bank because of all the attacks and the absence of movement, and the workers can't go to Israel. It's really economic desperation here. So there is this talk now behind the scenes, which hasn't come out yet, to bring in a new generation of leaders.
And are there any ideas coming forward for how a peace settlement might come about? Could Palestinian areas be a protectorate, perhaps by Sunni Muslim states? I mean, obviously there's been protectorates before, but one thing that's so apparent is that there is no substance of ideas coming forward as to how to get out of this death and destruction cycle and into any sort of peaceful settlement. Is there anything emerging where you are, of people looking forward and saying, look, this has to stop, and here is a possible game that doesn't end up in the death and destruction of the entire Palestinian people?
Well, I think there is some hope. These ceasefire talks are going on in Qatar, involving the United States, probably Arab states, Hamas itself. I feel quite optimistic that there will be a ceasefire fairly soon. To look at it in a very bleak way, if you look at past episodes involving Gaza, basically Israel likes to inflict 10 deaths for every one it receives. And we've now reached the 10-to-1 ratio, more or less. Also, I think Israel must surely see that it has ravaged its reputation by the sort of merciless carnage in Gaza, the destruction of hospitals, schools, more than 100 UN people dead, how many journalists, so many children. It's just heartrending. And America, which has given its unconditional support for the Israeli government, must see the immense damage done to its own international reputation. America used to claim, as did Britain, that we were on the side of human rights, freedom, democracy, and all of that. That reputation is gone. It's ruined across the world. And I think America must be realizing, I mean, Rishi Sunak is a moral nullity who more or less does what America wants, I think. But Joe Biden, the State Department, the CIA has broader vision and will see the calamitous damage being done to the America's reputation by its close involvement and support for what Israel has been doing in Gaza.
Finally, Peter Oborne, is that disintegration almost of the moral compass of or moral authority of the West, is that to you a greater danger than that of immediate escalation and the conflict spreading like a conflagration elsewhere in the Middle East? Is it that substantial medium-term damage in which you see some element of hope given the extent of it, or is the ever-present danger of escalation a very real one?
Well, the war does have the possibility to become a massive, terrible regional conflict, which would claim tens of thousands more lives. But it did appear that speech 9 days ago by Nasrallah in Lebanon did seem to indicate that neither Hezbollah nor Iran, its sponsor, really wanted to get involved at this stage if they could possibly avoid doing so. So I think that there is some hope that this conflict will simmer down for the time being, and we will have, and it should have happened, by the way, a month ago now. These deaths are awful. How can you, as a human being, witness or see what's been going on? And so I hope that we will have a ceasefire sooner rather than later. I do note that Qatar has played a positive role in all of this, being an intermediary. It's been heavily criticized. Why are you having Hamas? Why are you hosting Hamas? In a grown-up world, you need intermediaries. You need to have both sides talking to each other. And perhaps there are signs that is going to happen sooner rather than later.
Peter Oborne, you're on the spot in the West Bank. How much do you see of the international coverage, and how accurate a reflection are your colleagues managing to convey to the international audience of what's really going on at the present moment?
I think the first thing to say, Alex, is that Al Jazeera has the journalists there, we have to bow before them and honor their courage, self-sacrifice, and heroism, and the authority of their reporting. But for them, we would not be seeing so many of these awful pictures. That we would not be seeing the truth. It would be going on in the dark. Al Jazeera has done a phenomenal job. The Western media in general, back in London, I've been reading with revulsion the coverage of the mainstream British media, which concentrates on fighting little culture wars and doesn't give proper analysis or humane analysis, let alone humane analysis of what is actually happening politically and militarily out here. They just give the blind support for Israel and attack the people who are protesting against the massacres. The British media, mainstream media, has shamed itself.
In terms of the Israeli hostages, is any hope of release bound up on some sort of establishment of a ceasefire, that their fate is inextricably linked with some cessation, some stop firing, some cease firing, which is what a ceasefire means?
Yes, I made a wrong assumption at the start of this. Most people did, I think, which was that Israel would care about the fate of its hostages. It's clear that it doesn't. So, or rather, there are other considerations which weigh more heavily on Israel. Loads of the hostages have reportedly been killed tragically, and it's unspeakable. But Israel is prioritizing the fight against Hamas, as it sees it, over the rescuing the hostages. There was a deal available all along from Hamas to exchange hostages in some way. There are an enormous number of Palestinians in Israeli jails. They could be exchanged for the hostages seized on 7th of October. There was a deal available, but Israel hasn't been interested. But I still think that there can be a deal. How many of the hostages are still alive? Because, I mean, what terrible situation they are in. But I think that judging from its conduct, Israel's judgment is that hostages are not the prime reason for going to war. There are other things which come first.
Peter Oborne, how long do you believe you're going to be on the spot, giving us these insights? Are you there for the duration of the conflict, or when are you coming home?
I've been here almost a month. It's very tiring and exhausting, emotionally tiring, because you see all this horror. You have these discussions with people who have lived through nightmares. And I think that I will come home fairly soon. On the other hand, there is a kind of shame in this, isn't there? That the Palestinians, and above all the people in Gaza, they really have to stay for the duration. And the same and I, as a British journalist, can go home and put my feet up at a certain point.
Peter Oborne, thank you so much for giving us your insight on the spot in the occupied West Bank and joining us on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you.
Now, just as a long shot, Steve Richard, do you think this return of David Cameron has got anything to do with the big Brexit showdown debate in the Leicester Square Theatre on the Tuesday the 21st? You think Rishi Sunak realises the danger of that debate and is bringing in some heavy guns on his side? And will you be there covering it? That's what I want to know.
I think that uppermost in his mind, It wasn't whether you should sack Braverman or bring back the former Prime Minister. It was your debate, because you've got heavyweights on either side, and it must have so burdened him, especially as your side's going to win, that Brexit is a disaster. I know what to do. We'll bring back a Remainer. That should calm things down as I prepare for the debate in the Leicester Square Theatre, which will be epic. I can't make it, by the way. I'm desperate, so I'd love to go, but I know it'll be a great night.
Well, I can exclusively reveal that Downing Street's been asking us for free tickets, but we're saying you'll just have to pay like everyone else.
Quite right. Double.
Something particularly important in today's programme, we've had in Steve Richards and Peter Oborne, in some ways the last of their kind, two great, insightful commentators of the political scene, and they are few and far between these days, because the British press, the mainstream media, is so debased that there's hardly anyone of the calibre of a Richards or an Oborne, and to have two of them in the same programme is something very special. Thinking about Peter Oborne's commentary from Nablus, it does bring, as what he described as a sense of shame about the British media and about the British political system, I would argue, that they can see this crisis, this devastating death of thousands of people in Gaza, and see it as some sort of interplay between the British political parties. The Sunak government shadowing America, steadfastly in support of Israel come what may. Sir Keir Starmer frightened to say boo to the government unless he's labelled as an anti-Semite or a Palestinian sympathiser. The Suella Braverman calculating or perhaps even miscalculating. She sees this crisis with tens of thousands of people dying, and all she can whine about is demonstrations in the streets of the United Kingdom. People are demonstrating in the United Kingdom because ordinary folk don't like seeing atrocities. They don't like seeing atrocities committed against Israel. They certainly don't like tens of thousands of Palestinians or maybe 5,000 children being killed in Gaza. That's why they're demonstrating for a ceasefire. And British politicians seem to see it as some sort of party interchange. That is the debasement of politics, which matches the debasement of the mainstream media. What is totally missing, and perhaps there is some sort of responsibility, particularly as they should have, as Britain, as the ex-colonial power who created some of this mess, incidentally. But what is missing is any semblance of people coming forward with a solution. The international opinion is now totally moving against Israel. The leaders of Israel, the Israeli state at the present moment, don't seem to mind that as long as they carry the support of America. But surely in the medium term, the damage is going to be done to the Western reputation as a whole, that apparently people care so little for the deaths of 10,000 Palestinians. The people who are opposed to what's happening in the Gaza at the present moment are not some sort of sympathisers with Hamas. Hamas are a gang of cutthroats. They're not going to have any part in any solution in the Middle East. They're a bunch of thugs. That's obvious, a terrorist grouping. But equally, any decent human being shouldn't be looking at the deaths of tens of thousands of people and so many innocents and children and not trying to say there must be a cessation of hostilities. There must be a ceasefire. I found it incredible last weekend that people should actually be complaining that during an armistice weekend that there shouldn't be demonstrations for peace. That's what the armistice was in 1918. It was a ceasefire. It was a cessation of hostilities. People stopped firing. I'd have thought that would have been one of the better occasions in honouring those who've sacrificed so much to actually argue for peace, for a ceasefire, to stop the killing, and hopefully to start a dialogue which can bring forward solutions to the crisis in the Middle East. Because the crisis cannot be the evacuation of the Palestinians from their homeland. It can't be the mass slaughter of more innocent people, whether they be Israeli or Palestinian. There has to be a solution which looks at the Middle East as an area of some sort of stability where the killing can stop. That's what we should be concentrating on, not playing party games in British politics, not having phantom suggestions about the motives of demonstrators in the streets. We should respond to the extent of the crisis, and we would do a lot worse than listen to commentators like Steve Richardson and Peter Oborne, who may be the last of their kind, but still have plenty to teach us about the underlying causes of the crisis and pointing the way to a just solution. And now Tasmina is going to tell us about next week's episode of Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you, Alex. Now join us next week when the show goes stateside to consider the implications of a possible second term for the Donald. Join us then, not to be missed.
This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.